So in this video we're going to texture the fish, and we're going to do it in three parts. First of all, we're going to create a bump map, and then we're going to use that bump map to help us create a color map, and then we're going to use both those maps to help us complete the texturing. So the bump map is going to contain all of the detail for the scales on the body of the fish. Now obviously we don't want to paint each of those scales individually. We want to use an image map to help us paint it. So what we're going to do is use Modo to create that image map. So if we come to the item list, go to add item, go down to other and click new scene. So what we need to do is model a single scale. So let's just rotate the viewport so we're looking down. I'm going to run the cube primitive. Let's drag out a square, and I want there to be 2 segments on the X and 3 segments on the Z. Let's just stretch it out a little bit that way. Spacebar to drop the tool, then invert mode. I want to select these 2 points, hit B, and with a rounding level of 1 we'll just bevel that shape to create an arc on one side. And I might want to select that point in the middle to bring that up just to complete that curve. And then in polygon mode you can select all of those polygons, hit B, click in the viewport and inset it. And then we can select those polygons at the back and delete those. And in edge mode we can just move that edge back there. And finally we'll run the add loop tool and we'll put an edge right at the back. So now if we hit the tab key we get that kind of shape. Now we need some thickness, so in polygon mode I'm going to hit Shift X for polygon extrude, click in the viewport and we'll just bring that down. Hit the tab key. Let's go to the basic tab, center selected, and we'll center it in space. And the scale shouldn't be flat, it needs to be angled slightly. So I'm going to hit E, and I'm just going to rotate it by about 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, and move it up so it's above the ground plane. Now we need lots of these scales, and the best way to duplicate something like this is with a replicator. Now for a replicator to work we need a point source. So if we go to the item list, go to add item and select a new mesh item, go to the vertex tab and run the vertex tool, click in the viewport and hit spacebar, and you won't see anything in the viewport, but if you hit 5 on the numeric keypad we go to a wireframe view and we can see that point. Now we just need it centered, so go to the basic tab, center selected, all, and now we can add the replicator. So we'll go to add item, duplication, replicator, and in properties we'll set the prototype to be the first mesh and the point source to be the second mesh. Now at the moment the replica is being drawn as a bounding box, and to change that we'll just go to this menu, go to the shade options, replicators, and change it to all. And now if we go back to the layer with the point in, go to vertices mode, hit W. We just want to move that copy so it's sitting next to the original scale. Now the scales overlap each other, so I'm going to create a second replica now. So with that point selected, I'm just going to hit Control C and then Control V to copy and paste it. Hit W, and we'll move this one back so it's sitting between the first two, and then we'll pull it forward. So now that we've got the basic structure in place, we can create loads of them. We'll start by hitting 4 on the numeric keypad just to go back to a wireframe view. Let's zoom out. Now make sure those points are deselected. We'll go to the duplicate tab and run the array tool. Now let's just start off by putting a count of 10 on the X and 10 on the Z. Click in the viewport and then use the red handle to move the replicas over so they're sitting nicely next to each other, and then the blue handle to make sure that they're sitting nicely along the Z, so they're sitting nicely on top of each other. So when you're happy with that you can then decide exactly how many you need. So let's put 40 on the X and 40 on the Z. And we can see that isn't a square, so let's put 50 on the Z, maybe 60, and 50 on the X. Okay, that looks good to me. So drop the tool. So now we have a model of some scales, but they don't look very realistic because they're all exactly the same, and that just doesn't happen in nature. So we need to add some variation. So let's go back to the replicator, go down to properties, and under random scale, let's click on the gang edit. So we're going to type one value into one channel and it'll be copied to all the other channels, and we'll set a random scale of 10%. And then if we go to the random twist entry, again click the gang edit, and we'll set a random twist of 2 degrees. Now you can see it's already beginning to look more realistic, but because we put the random twist on, they're starting to cross each other. So to fix that, we'll go back to the original scale that we modelled. I'm going to hit Shift A to centre it. Now what we need to do is hit the E key and just rotate the scale so all of those scales start to separate. Now if you're finding that OpenGL is beginning to slow down, let's go back to the viewport menu, go back to shade options, replicators, and turn it back to bounding box. So now we need to bake these scales down to an image map, and to do that we need to bake them to something. So we need to create a new mesh item, and in this mesh item we'll just create a single polygon. So let's go to the basic tab on the cube tool, just have one segment on all the axes, and we'll just drag that out. We'll make sure it's zeroed on a work plane, so we'll just set the position to be 0 on Y, and we'll just make sure that it sits under all of those scales. So we need to give that polygon a material name, so hit M. I'm just going to call it bake, hit OK, and then we'll go over to the shader tree. Now when we created that polygon, it will have automatically created UVs. So if we go over to the list tab, expand UV maps, and make sure that that texture UV is selected. Then we'll come to the texture menu and we'll click add displacement texture, select where you want to save it, and we'll just give it a name. I'm going to call it scales. Click save. Now we want to choose a resolution. Now we've got quite a lot of detail in here, and having a big resolution isn't going to be a bad thing. So I'm going to choose a 4K map, so keep the rest of the defaults, and click OK. So now we'll go over to properties, and let's go down to texture layers. Now when you add a displacement texture, it automatically sets a high and a low value based on the scale of the object. Now we don't want that, so I'm going to set the low value to 0 and the high value to 100%. So now we can bake it. So right click on the image map in the shader tree and select bake object to texture. Then we need to set a baking distance, and I'm just going to double the grid distance here in the bottom right hand corner. So I'm going to type in 100 millimeters and click OK. So when that's finished, close the render window, we've got File and Save All Images. So if you open up that Scales EXR in Photoshop, you can see it's grey and you can barely see the scales. So what we need to do is go to Image, Adjustments, Levels, and you can see how tight that is. So we'll just move these to tighten the range up, and now we can see our scales. Now I still think that's too grey, so I'm going to run levels again and tighten it up so the border is black. So when you're happy with that, click OK, and then I'm just going to crop the whole image so I get rid of that border. And finally, the scales are vertical and I want them to be horizontal so they'll be easier to paint across the body of the fish. So let's go to Image, Rotate Canvas 90 degrees counterclockwise. So save your image, and then we'll go back to Modo, we can close this scale scene, we don't need it anymore. Go back to the rockfish, and now we can start painting. Okay, so let's go over to the Paint tab. We'll select the Rockfish 1 UV map. Let's expand the shader tree, go to the body material, and we'll hide the transparency and displacement map. So just to make the model even easier to see, we'll just hide the wireframe. We'll select the body material and we'll turn symmetry on the X. Then we'll go to texture, go add blank color texture, and I'm going to call this color. Click save. I want it to be a 4K map, and I want to set the initial color, and I want the initial color to be white, and we just need it to be a grayscale. So I'll run the airbrush and also image ink. Then we need to select an ink, so open up the image browser. Now you'll need to set a path to your image directory or to wherever you saved the scales EXR. So we'll open that up. Now you need to select the scales EXR, and we'll just wait for those thumbnails to draw. There we go. So select the scales EXR, click in the 3D view, and the image will appear in the viewport. Now I'm going to scale it so it roughly fills the 3D viewport. Let's just rotate the fish around. Now I'm not going to touch the scale of that image in the viewport at all now. If I want the scales to be smaller on the fish, I'll zoom in, and if I want them to be bigger on the fish, I'll zoom out when I paint. Now I don't like having the image visible in the 3D viewport because it clutters things up. So I'm going to come down to the pipeline, and next to image ink I'm going to click on the dot in the V column, and that will hide it. So with a white foreground color, right click to define the brush size, click on the fish, there'll be a slight delay, and then you can start painting scales on the side of the fish. Now as they come along the body, they need to kind of follow the line of the body, so you need to kind of slightly rotate the fish around, and then as you get to the tail you need to zoom in and make the scales smaller. So you want the bigger scales to be around the stomach area, and it'll get smaller towards the tail, and the smallest scales will be around the head. Now one thing to remember is that because we're painting in symmetry, we'll end up with this symmetry line running down the middle, and that doesn't look too realistic. But there's nothing stopping us turning symmetry off occasionally and painting over that line, and that'll help to add some asymmetry to the textures. So once you've got all of the scales laid down on the body, you need to think about how you're going to modulate the strength of the bump across the body. Now the most amount of bump is going to occur on the side of the fish, but the head is going to be quite smooth. So I'm going to turn image ink off, and again still with a white paint, I'm just going to start to knock some of this back in the areas that I want to be smoother. Now another thing to do is to try and blend the scales out across the fin, so you can reduce the opacity of the brush, have quite small scales, and we're just going to blend them out to nothing from the base of the fin. We need to do the same on this side, but we need to spin the whole thing over to do it, to get the scales to run in the right direction. So now we can take a look at this image as a bump map. So let's go over to the render tab, just zoom into preview and rotate the fish around. Now we can bring back the transparency and also the displacement map, and if we right click on the effect column for the color map, we can go down to surface shading and change the effect to bump. Now by default the bump amplitude is far too big, so if we select the body material, come out to properties, and let's set the bump amplitude to 1 millimeter. So next we need to paint a color map, but we need to use the bump map that we created to modulate the color as we lay it down, because the color of the scales is different to the color between the scales. So the first thing we need to do is to create a mask. So I've opened up the bump map in Photoshop. Now to use this as a mask, we need it to have more contrast. So I'm going to run levels, and we'll just tighten that up. Okay, and we'll save that as a PNG and we'll call it mask. So we're going to paint this in layers, and we'll start with the base, and that's an off-white under its belly, and that gradually becomes yellow further up the fish. So I'm going to go texture, add blank color texture, and we'll call this base. Click save. Again, that needs to be 4K map. Just have it as RGB, and we'll set that initial color to be that off white, so it just needs to be a slight yellow, very light yellow. Click OK. Okay, that will load in. And then we need to go to properties and adjust the gamma to match the output gamma when we render, so that the final color output is 2.2. So we need to make sure this gamma is 1 divided by 2.2. So let's turn symmetry on the X, and I'm just going to run an airbrush, and I want my color to be almost white. And I'm just going to paint the belly of the fish. Just want to make sure that that area down there is white compared to the rest of it. So I've brought the white under the belly, around the mouth, and particularly inside the mouth. One of the features of rockfish is it has a white line running from the tail along the body to the head. So I just want to define that next. So I'm going to just put some white in there. It just kind of runs across the base of the tail, and then with a smaller brush just going to bring this along the body all the way to there. So next I want to bring a much more intense yellow across the body. So I'm going to select a really nice deep yellow color, and I'll apply that. But when I come around to the belly, I want to blend it out. So next I want to paint an orange layer on top of this, but importantly I just want the orange to be picked up on the scales, and we can use the mask that we created to do this. So we need to load the mask into the scene. So if we go to the images tab, go to add clip, load image, select the mask and click open. Now importantly, I don't want to paint it on this base image. I want to preserve that image map because I might need to change it later on. So I'm going to create a new image layer on top of that. So go to texture, add blank color texture. We'll call this orange. Click save. We need it to be a 4K map. This time we want it to be an RGBA and will not set an initial color. Click OK. And with that loaded in, we just need to adjust the gamma. And now we can start painting. So we're on the airbrush tool and also image ink. We'll not have an ink image, but we do want the mask. So go down to UV mask and select the mask image. Now we want the color to be a bright orange. So we'll select the color. And with symmetry on, right click. We'll start to paint, and you can see as I paint, you can see that orange is only coming on those scales. I'm just going to increase my opacity, bring it to about 75. So I just want to paint across these scales. Again, this needs to kind of blend out towards the lighter areas. So just to break up this white area with a very low opacity, say 30%, just a very light touch, just bring some of that red or that orange across, and because of the opacity level, it'll actually come through as more of a pink colour, and it'll just help to break that area up. So with that done, I've added another layer on top of the orange called red. I've adjusted the gamma, and the next thing I want to do is paint a much cooler red across the fins and also the head. Now when I paint, I don't want it to paint a straight colour. I want to break it up a little bit with the noise. So this time I'm going to load an image ink. So I'm going to bring up the image ink browser, and in your image directory you'll find a JPEG called ink. Select that. Still have the UV mask selected, and now I want to select a much cooler red colour. Again, still with symmetry on. We can start to paint. I'm keeping the opacity quite low because I want to build this up. So you can see how that noise is coming through there as we're painting. Now we want this red to come back and kind of blend from the base of the fins out into the more orange body. Now if you're finding it difficult to actually see what's going on, come over to the render layer, go to global illumination, enable global illumination, and then just activate RayGL, and that will give you a much better idea of how things are working out. So I've added another layer called fin tips, adjusted the gamma, again with symmetry on. I just need a white or a slightly off-white, and we just want to pick up the end of each of these fins. We want to kind of muddy them up a little bit. Because at the moment they're just too hot. So I've just brought back the transparency and displacement map and turned RayGL on, so we get a really good feeling for what's happening with the fins, and you can see by adding that grey it really helps to knock them back. Now one of the beauties of painting it in layers like this is it's very easy to change things. For example, I think the red layer that I painted is far too intense. It's kind of taking over from the orange. So I just want to knock that back. So to do it I just need to select that red layer, and I'm just going to drop the opacity to 80%. So with RayGL turned off, I'm now going to hide that red layer, select the orange layer, and with an airbrush and image ink I'm going to paint in more orange into this layer. So now that I've brought that red layer back, I'm much happier with the way the colours are sitting with each other now. So I've added another layer now called head details, adjusted the gamma. Let's just turn off the transparency and displacement maps, turn RayGL off. Now there's lots of little nice details around the head. There's the eye, there's the horns, and then there's black marks that run around the head. So let's start with the horns. So with symmetry on, let's just run airbrush, and we just want white or a slightly off-white, and we just want to pick, we'll paint the ends of these horns. So I've painted all of those white bits across the head, but there's also much darker scale marks. Now to do that, I'm going to use the Scales EXR that we used to create the bump map. So I'm going to run an airbrush and image ink. I want the image ink to be the Scales EXR, so select it. Now we don't want to use the mask, so let's open up that browser and select none. But make sure that you have use color as mask active, and select your color. So I want this to be a dark brown. Click in the 3D view, I'll right click for my brush size, and I'm going to zoom in quite closely and then start to paint these in. Now obviously image ink is there, but it's not visible in the viewport, but it just allows us to paint that in. As you can see, that really helps to kind of dirty up that color and make it more interesting. And you can also do the same along the body here. What we'll do is we'll go back to the base layer. So we're now going to be painting underneath the orange layer, and now we can just start to bring some marks in like that. It just helps to kind of break it up and make it look more realistic. So the final thing to paint is the eye. So select the head details layer. We'll hide the fish and we'll hide the outside of the eye. Select the airbrush and a gold color and paint out this red. So then run image ink, and with the ink JPEG loaded, select a slightly darker yellow, and then paint around the outside. I've got an opacity of say 50%. We can gradually build it up so it's darker in some areas. So when you've finished your painting, we now need to bake all of those color maps down into one single image map. So to do that, I've created a new blank image and place it at the top of the body mask. I'm going to shift select all of the other color maps, and I'm going to set the gamma to 1. Then I'll select the main image map, right click and select bake to texture. So when that's finished, close the render window. We can now shift select all of the other color maps, right click and delete them, then select the color map and then set the gamma to 1 divided by 2.2. So over in preview, with the transparency and displacement map visible, you can see it's really starting to look like a rockfish. So in this section I want to complete the texturing. So we'll start with the basic material settings. So select the material layer for RF body. And I'll start by activating conserve energy, and that helps to balance the specular amount with the diffuse amount to create a more physically accurate result. And you can see that the specular highlight there is far too bright, so I'm going to knock that down to 2%. And we also need some subsurface scattering on the fish, so I'm going to go to Material Trans, I'm going to put a subsurface amount of 50%, and we need a blood colour for that. Now also I want to add some reflection to this fish. I want it to be more of a Fresnel effect, so it's more reflective as the incidence angle increases. So I can do that with a gradient. So I'm going to add layer, and we'll come down to processing, we'll add a gradient, We'll set the effect to reflection amount. The input parameter is already incidence, so we'll open up the gradient. We need a new key, so hold down Alt and Control, and I want to create the key at around about 90 degrees. So the first key, we need that to be 0 reflection, so change the value to 0. And then the second key, select that, and we want that value to be 10%. Now if you look in preview, you can see by adding the reflection and the subsurface scattering, we've got a problem in the transparent areas. You can see on this fin here, if I just zoom in, you see although we have transparency on it, we're not modulating the reflection amount or the subsurface scattering amount in those areas. So we need to create some image maps that will modulate it. So if you go over to Photoshop and open up the transparency map and also the bump map. So the bump map is going to allow us to modulate the subsurface scattering and reflection across the entire surface, which is going to create a much more interesting surface. And the transparency map is going to allow us to kill subsurface scattering and reflection on the fins. So we need to join these two image maps. So select the transparency map and then select the whole thing, go to Edit Copy, go back to the bump map and Edit Paste. Now we're going to have to invert this layer because at the moment the transparent areas are white, and to kill something it needs to be black. So we'll just go to Image Adjustments and Invert. And to be able to see both layers together, we just need to change the blending mode of this transparent layer to multiply. As you can see, because we use different UV maps for painting these two images, we've got some areas overlapping, but because we organized it so the fins were always going to be in the same place, we can delete one out and to leave the other. So we need the transparency layer. So select the bump layer, we need a white ink, grab a brush, let's have 82 brush size, and we just need to paint out that section of the bump map. So we can then flatten the image so it's one layer. Now before I actually save this out, I just want to change it slightly because the head is a lot brighter than the rest of the body, so most of the specularity and subsurface scattering is going to happen on the head, and I want it to happen more evenly across the whole thing. So I'm going to run the lasso select tool, and I'm just going to lasso the head section. Then we'll go to Edit, Image Adjustments, and we'll run Brightness and Contrast. And we just want to make it a little bit darker. I want to kind of maintain the contrast but make the whole thing around about the same tone as the rest of the image map. Looks good to me. So OK that, we'll deselect it, and we'll go File, Save As, and we can save it as RFSSS. I'm going to save it as a PNG. So then back in Modo we can add that image map and make sure that it's using the Rockfish 2 UV. Right click on the effect column and we'll change this to subsurface amount. Make sure the high value is 50%, and if you look in preview now you can see how the subsurface scattering has been taken out of the eye and also the fins. So to modulate the specularity, we'll just right click on that image map in the shader tree, we'll create an instance of it, right click in the effect column and change the effect to specular amount, and then change the high value to 2%. Now if you look closely at the fin, you can see we've still got some ghosting in these transparent areas, and that's being caused by this gradient. So to modulate the gradient, we'll grab the transparency map, right click and duplicate it, move it above the gradient, and right click in the effect column and change the effect to reflection amount. Then we need to invert that map and change the blend mode to multiply. Now if you look in preview you can see all of those transparent areas have been perfectly clipped away now. So that's the basic textures in place. We can refine them later on if need be, but now we need to start to think about how we're going to make this fish swim.